Good day, everyone. Today is Thursday, February 18th, 2016. It's 1 o'clock Eastern. We're at the start of today's webinar, Preparing a Budget and Budget Justification for Your NSF ATE Proposals. My name is Mike Lasecki. I'm the host for today's webinar, and I'd like to take you first through a couple of opening slides. For those of you not familiar with the Adobe Connect interface, you can see the list of participants and presenters on the right-hand side of your screen. We encourage you to type your comments and questions that you have here anytime, and you can use the chat window, so just go ahead and send them to all. Easy enough. We'll prompt you on that as we go forward. We'll have question breaks designed in today's webinar. We're not going to use the raise your hand function today, so let me now turn towards today's presenters. It's my pleasure to introduce our lead presenter, Elaine Kraft. She's the principal investigator at the Mentor Connect project, which is titled Leadership Development and Outreach for ATE. She's also the director of the South Carolina ATE Center of Excellence. Elaine, welcome today. Say hello to everyone, and then please go ahead and introduce your co-presenters.
Thank you, Mike. It is my pleasure to be with you today, and I'd like to introduce my co-PI for the Mentor Connect project, Ellen Haas, and another co-PI for the project, Charlotte Forrest, who also serves as our project manager. And a special welcome to Dr. Celeste Carter. She is co-lead for the ATE program at the National Science Foundation, and she will be on hand throughout the webinar to answer your questions. Ellen, Charlotte, and I will provide information about Mentor Connect and preparing budgets and budget justifications for NSF ATE proposals. I also want to thank our colleague, Mike Lasecki, and his capable team at Maytech Networks for facilitating this webinar. And of course, none of this would be possible without our funding source, the National Science Foundation Advanced Technological Education Program. As we provide information today, please remember that the Mentor Connect team is not speaking on behalf of the National Science Foundation. The opinions we express are our own. We will be sharing information extracted from NSF publications and from our own experience. Trust me, we've learned a lot from making many of the mistakes that we hope to help you avoid. We will begin today's webinar with an introduction to the Mentor Connect project, followed by an overview of an important activity that grant proposal development we call budgeting. Next, we will walk you through the actual NSF budget form you will use as you complete your proposal. We will cover all components of this form, section by section, line by line. We will also discuss the required budget justification that must accompany the budget form. You will be given several opportunities throughout the webinar to ask questions. We will conclude by asking you to complete a very brief evaluation survey. The information you provide will help us improve our Mentor Connect technical assistance webinars and capture essential data that we need for reporting to the National Science Foundation. Funding from the National Science Foundation ATE program makes the work of Mentor Connect possible. You might wonder why we are providing this type of technical assistance to potential NSF ATE grantees. The answer lies in the goals and objectives of the Mentor Connect project. The overarching goal of Mentor Connect is to broaden the impact of the NSF ATE program. One of the ways we are doing this is by engaging community colleges that have not yet benefited from NSF funding. We are introducing diverse educators to the NSF ATE program, resources, and opportunities, and helping them learn how to prepare competitive proposals. Mentor Connect is using mentoring to develop new ATE grantees and leaders across the country to strengthen technician and related STEM education. What we want you to learn today is what information you should put in the various blanks on the budget form, how to prepare a budget justification, why a good budget helps make a good proposal, how you can avoid common errors, and where you can find budgeting answers and other help along the way to becoming an ATE grantee. The budget form that I have referred to is an online form to be completed in the NSF FastLane system. For information you enter into this form becomes part of your overall grant proposal. While it is permissible to submit grant proposals using grants.gov, we strongly encourage you to use FastLane for submitting grant proposals to the NSF. There are extra steps required for information to be transferred from grants.gov to NSF, and these extra steps can cause you to miss the NSF deadline and/or result in the omission of required forms that could result in a proposal being returned without review. The budget section of FastLane proposal submission process is designed to generate year-by-year and cumulative budget requests for your proposal. As you proceed, it calculates totals for the separate budget categories and by year. Once budget forms are completed for each year of the project, the automated system generates a cumulative budget for the entire proposal. The budget justification, however, is not a form. You will need to develop this document from scratch to explain the amounts entered in the budget form and how they relate to your project plan. The key thing to remember is that your budget should clearly and specifically align with the scope of work of the project. There should be a very clear link between the money being requested and what you are requesting the money to accomplish. Time and time again today, I will mention the codependence of various parts of your grant proposal. Correlation and consistency throughout is very important. Now, as we get started, let's find out how much experience you have had with NSF budgets. Mike, will you poll the audience on this question?
Thank you, Elaine. Folks, if you please, I see most of you are already answering. In the upper right pane, you'll see a yes, no, or to this. Have you ever had experience completing an NSF budget on FastLane? You probably know this answer. It's either yes or no. Okay, the results are in. Let's go ahead and take a look at the results.
Well, Mike, it
So
looks
there we are,
like
Elaine. I'm sorry, yeah, it looks like more than half of us have done it, but quite a few haven't. Sorry for the little delay there.
Right. Yeah,
Okay.
it looks like we have a mix of experience in the audience today. Whether you are a budget veteran or this is all brand new to you, over the next hour, we hope to increase your understanding of budget and budget justification preparation. So, how do you get to the budget form in FastLane? As you can see on this slide, it takes several keystrokes. I will walk you through this process that goes from the NSF homepage to FastLane to proposal functions to login and to proposal component forms, and then finally to the budget form. It isn't necessary to write all of this down. You will have access to these slides following the webinar. The first step is the NSF homepage, www.nsf.gov. Look for the FastLane button in the upper right-hand corner. Your proposal work will be done in FastLane. Anyone can access FastLane, but to begin working on a proposal, you must be registered with FastLane. The institution that will be the fiscal agent for the grant and certain grant personnel must be registered. The institution must be registered first, and then one or more account administrators named. Once someone at the institution has administrative rights, then it is possible to register other individuals. To be named as principal investigator, co-principal investigator, or senior personnel on a grant, a person must be registered. Even though some people never have a reason to actually work in the FastLane proposal submission system, they still must be registered to be included in the budget in a key personnel role for the project. Typically, a sponsored research officer or grant writer for the institution will register the institution, and then this administrator will register individuals for the grant being developed. On this slide, you can see the place on the FastLane landing page where these registration tasks can be accomplished. All senior personnel must be registered. For any of you in the audience who may be working on a larger ATE project or center proposal with subawards, the same thing applies for subaward budgets. The organization and personnel associated with any subaward must be registered in FastLane. Subaward budgets must have their own budget justification and are subject to the criteria we will discuss today regarding the primary project budget. Now, back to the FastLane landing page. To work on the budget or any other section of a grant proposal, look for Proposals, Awards, and Status. Then select Proposal Preparation under Proposal Functions. Next, you will need to log in. To do this, an assigned NSF ID number and password are required. The registration process generates an ID number and the user sets a password to allow access to the system. Once you get an ID number and have set a password, do not lose either piece of information. You will need your unique user ID and password time and time again. It is a good idea to give your director of grants or someone else you trust a copy of your information. You will need to reset your password the first time you access the system and at least annually thereafter. Once you've logged in, then you select Budget from the list of options. Next, you will begin by selecting funds for year one. You will notice that this is also the screen where you will upload your budget justification. Note the error. There are options provided when working on this page that are helpful. For example, if your budget will be very similar year to year, you have an option to have the information from one year transferred to the budget form for the next year. If you do this, however, be very careful to make sure that you make edits that are applicable for the next year's work and keep things aligned with your budget justification. Realistic budgets are rarely identical year to year, but rather change as the project progresses and activities and anticipated costs change. To start your budget, you begin with personnel costs. The first information to enter is about senior personnel, Section A of the budget. You don't actually enter names on the budget form, but rather you select from a list of those who have been previously registered for your institution. You may only select individuals who've been previously registered in FastLane. This is just one of many good reasons for not doing your budget work at the last minute. If you discover that someone you need to name in the budget hasn't been registered, it will take a little time to get this done, and only someone with administrative rights in FastLane can register the individual. The same thing is true for subawards. The subaward organization must be registered in FastLane, and all senior personnel included in the subaward budget must be registered with that organization. These are definitely not last-minute tasks. I've personally faced a crisis or two over the years with this issue, and it is no fun. My advice is that if you have multiple people you could include in your budget, register all of them. When you prepare the budget, you only select the ones you want to include. You can also deselect a name if plans change, so don't delay in registering personnel in FastLane because you're not yet sure exactly who will be included in your budget. Note the Calculate option that will appear at the end of each budget section. It is helpful to keep an eye on the calculated totals as you go along. But beware. The calculate function does not save your information should you exit the system. I will show you where you have the option to save your work. If you scroll all the way down to the bottom of the form, there is, in section L, there is a calculate and save button. If you do this, you can come back to the budget at any time, and previously entered information will be waiting for you. Forget, and you get to start all over again. Now, I will walk you through several additional sections of the budget form. Here are just a few pointers as you go through the budget form preparation process. First, the form will be the same format each year. Subtotals and totals are calculated automatically, provided you select Calculate, and at the end of the page, click Save. The FastLane system will transfer totals in each category and prepare the cumulative budget page for you automatically. This is one thing you don't have to do, and that is really nice. On this slide, you can see an actual budget form. On the left, the NSF budget categories are listed. This list is important. We strongly recommend that you use these categories in the alphabetical order presented as an organizing tool for your budget justification. Both reviewers and program officers will appreciate a budget that is organized this way. A little later, I will show you an example of how to do this. These NSF budget categories are likely to be different than the budgets you may work with at your college. It is important to understand how NSF interprets each of these categories so that you can plan and submit your budget accordingly. Once funded, you will need to work with your business office to develop a clear crosswalk between the NSF budget categories and the budget codes that will be used by your college. Now, let's look at the budget categories. As you can see, there are two personnel sections. Section A, Senior Personnel, and Section B, Other Personnel. There is a separate Section C for including fringe benefits that are associated with the personnel costs at your institution. So, who are senior personnel? The senior personnel category typically includes the principal investigator, co-principal investigator or investigators, and others in leadership or significant roles who will receive financial support from the project. These are key project personnel whose credentials are part of the intellectual merit of the project. In other words, reviewers will look at these individuals to determine if they appear to have the expertise and experience to accomplish the work of the project. In general, those in senior personnel roles should be getting financial support to conduct the work of the project and help ensure its success. However, if you have a person serving in a senior personnel role who will not receive money from the grant, the individual should not be included in the budget. Do not include anyone for whom the budget entry will be $0 for the person. Stated differently, every senior personnel named in the budget should be associated with a dollar amount. For those of you who may not have submitted a proposal to NSF in recent years, you will recognize this as a change. At one time, all senior personnel names were included in the budget with a time allocation, even if there was no payment associated with that person's time on the project. This practice is no longer acceptable. So if you name them in the budget, they've got to have a dollar amount associated with that and with the time that they're going to be spending on the project. It is important that the amount you budget for an individual align with the institutional salaries or pay rates for that individual. An individual may not be paid more or less than the standard or normal institutional compensation for the individual. Do not budget or plan for an individual to receive from the institution more than 100% of a full-time salary for the person. This is an important point that causes great grief among community college faculty because it means that while working on the grant, no overload pay may be received for teaching an extra course or for doing grant work during the academic year. Grant work should be contained within the normal workload. This is an issue that's currently being looked at. The program officers at NSF, particularly in the ATE program, who work so closely with community college, know what an issue this is. But at this point in time, this is still the way it is interpreted at NSF and the way you should plan. There are some very specific short-term exceptions to this NSF rule, and work can be scheduled with compensation during summer months or other times that a faculty member isn't under academic year contract, but don't plan on being an exception to the no overload pay rule. Even when developing your budget, you should be talking with your program officer if you have concerns about this or you're not sure whether or not you're getting that right. I mentioned the codependence of the budget with the proposal, and senior personnel time on the project is something that shows up multiple times in a grant proposal. It is important that the information you provide be consistent with each reporting. For example, senior personnel time will appear on current and pending support forms. It'll appear in the budget. It'll appear in the budget justification and in a required list of individuals. You have to put a required list in the proposal of individuals receiving compensation from the grant. It is easy to get tripped up, particularly if you make changes in your budget as you go along. So be careful and consistent. When you allocate funds to support personnel, you need to be reasonable and very specific, both within the proposal and in your budget justification, about the work the individual will be doing for that compensation. It is never good if an individual appears to reviewers to be overcompensated for too little work, as specified in the project description. Likewise, reviewers worry when there is too little compensation for an extensive scope of work. Principal investigators are expected to be compensated for their time working on the project, either with direct financial support or with release time. Because time and compensation calculations are an area where reviewers and program officers often find errors, I want to provide a couple of very specific examples to help you do this right. Before I walk you through this example, I would like to make a couple of important notes. If you are carefully reading the NSF guidelines, you may see a reference to a 2-month limit on faculty time. The ATE program is an exception. Faculty are not limited to 2 summer months for ATE grant work, as is the case with many other NSF programs. And the other point I want to make is that faculty time should always be reported as academic or summer months, not calendar months. Now, in this first example, we will assume that the principal investigator is a faculty member whose 9-month or academic year contract is $54,000. This faculty member plans to spend the equivalent of 1 day per 5-day week working on the project during fall and spring semesters, and he or she will work full-time on the grant for an equivalent of 2 months in the summer. During the academic year, this work plan is 1/5 or 20% of the person's time. This will be release time. It could be, for example, 1 course release for a faculty member typically teaching 5 courses per semester. However, the typical faculty teaching load is likely different for my college. So you will want to calculate the percentages and work month equivalents based on your college's faculty loading practices. Then you prorate the budget request accordingly. Even if a faculty member will be working on your grant all year long, don't use 12 months in the budget or on current and pending support forms. The time that you should include on the budget is the fraction of that person's total work time that will be supported by NSF funds. To do this calculation, you need the person's salary per month and the number of academic months that equate to this amount of release time. For the summertime, you just need to know what monthly salary rate to apply. The time calculation gives us 1.8 academic months for the faculty member's time in the fall and spring semesters. To this, add 2 months' salary for summer work. The total time is reported separately by academic months and summer months but the budget dollar request will be the sum of the two amounts of money. Note, you should never put a number in the calendar month box when you are reporting academic or summer months and vice versa. Here's one more example. This time we are looking at an individual who is not a faculty member and works on a 12-month contract at the college. The person's 12-month salary is $40,000 in this example. If you do not have a gross monthly amount available, divide the annual salary by 12 to determine the monthly amount to use. The person's time commitment to the project will be 1 day a week per 5-day week year-round, or 20% of his or her time. The first step is to determine the equivalent number of calendar months. In this case, 20% yields 2.4 months. The monthly amount is multiplied by 2.4 to provide the budget amount for the year. The time in this example should be reported as calendar months. This is a staff person who works 12 months a year, and so you use the calendar month category. Again, you should never, ever, ever mix calendar months with the other categories when reporting a person's time. If you put a number in the calendar box, leave the other two blank. One more reminder. The budget should be based on prorated time equivalents. Even though a person may be working on the project, over the 12-month time, as I mentioned before, you only report the portion of that 12-month time for which the grant support is being requested. Also, you may neither elevate nor decrease a person's salary with grant support. NSF expects grant funds to support a personnel at the same rate of pay the organization would pay the person if there were no grant support. The person's time will be allocated differently to allow for project implementation, but the rate of pay remains the same. Now, we want to check and see if you are still awake. So we have a quiz for you. So Mike, do you want to run this poll? And then we'll turn it over to Dr. Celeste Carter, who will give them the correct answer and talk about some of the mistakes to avoid.
Yes, I do. Lane, in the upper right of the screen, let me see if I can't reposition this one a little bit to make it easier here for us to take a look at. Just a second. Okay, there we go. Let's just give people to do it a moment to answer this question. I'm going to reposition this now again so it doesn't block the, there we go. Thanks. Okay, so you have a number of people answering. It says you want to request 20% of a faculty member's salary for one course reduction. That's pretty typical, right? How will you enter that in the budget, A, B, C, D, or E? 20% of a faculty salary. They seem to be getting this one, folks. Celeste, I'm going to unmute you just a moment here. Celeste, looking at the results of the poll, and could you turn your microphone back on? There you go. Looking at the results of the poll, the large majority of us chose 1.8 academic months. Is that the right answer?
That's the correct answer.
All right, you sound good.
And that's based, although I would say that that's based on what your contract actually is. We started with the 9-month academic contract. Every once in a while, you'll find people that have a 10-month contract. So you want to be careful with your own institution of knowing what your contract is.
Okay. Well, it's on there to you. Are you taking us forward, Celeste, at this point?
I think I am.
Okay, good. Should I? You want to advance your own slides?
Let's see.
On the lower left, those arrows on the lower left there. There you go.
Got it.
Very good.
Okay. So some of the things that I think Elaine has already gone over that you want to not make as far as mistakes go is putting the percent of time instead of months. You don't want to put, and I do see this, Elaine has already said it a couple of times, I often turn to the budget page and it says that people will be working 12 academic months, 12 calendar months, 9 academic months, and 2 summer months. And it always makes all of us chuckle a little bit because there aren't that many months in the year. So you want to be sure that you don't do that. You want the portion of the months you're going to be working on, not the total. And again, there's that academic and calendar months. You're picking one or the other. Sometimes I know we haven't gotten to budget justification yet, but it can be a bit confusing with senior personnel when it's a mix, say, of maybe a dean is on there who might be a 12-month individual rather than a faculty member who's on a 9-month calendar. Or I should say, I shouldn't mix those terms up, 9-month contract. In a budget justification, you might, after the person's name, just to make it easier for all of us program officers who struggle over these budgets, to put in parentheses whether or not the person is a 12-month salaried person or a faculty on a 9-month contract. And that's just a little bit that would that would help all of us here at the National Science Foundation. You want to put your principal investigators at this point, and the other senior personnel. Faculty that are not at your college don't belong on your budget form. We'll get around to subawards in a little while. And then that there's no dollar amount in the budget. So people are donating their time for free to this project. At this point in time, the National Science Foundation sees that as cost sharing, which is not allowed. So same thing goes with the principal investigator. So let's see. I think I turn it back over to Elaine for this next slide.
Okay, thank you, Celeste. Moving on to the next category of the budget form, which is alphabet letter B, other personnel. You can see from this photo of the actual budget form, the other personnel section has several categories that are not likely to be applicable to NSF ATE grants, such as postdoctoral scholars. So, who are other personnel? Your other personnel who will be compensated will help you with your project. I've seen this category used for jobs such as lab assistant, webmaster, other technical support personnel, or project coordinator. It can also be used for adjunct faculty if you've got adjunct faculty that you're hiring to replace other faculty. Secretarial or clerical support can be included only in very limited specific circumstances. In most cases, indirect costs are designed to cover this expense. The NSF Grant Proposal Guide, Chapter 2, Section G, on budgets and budget justifications, provides specifics. To be eligible, the work must clearly support the work of the grant, be distinct and distinguishable from functions that are normally performed by the college. Be aware that students are typically paid hourly rates, and the time is capped at 20 hours per week during the academic year and 40 hours per week in the summer. The total amount to be paid based on your hourly calculations in the budget justification will be inserted on this form. You will not include bios for individuals budgeted in this category. Again, consider the type of contract the person has with the college to determine the way you should report the time for other professionals. If the person is on a 12-month contract, use calendar months. If on a separate academic and summer contracts, use those categories, such as adjunct faculty. For students, secretarial and other categories, only the total compensation amount for the year is requested. However, a detailed explanation for this expense and why it is necessary should be included in your budget justification. Once you have entered all personnel salaries and wages, next, fringe benefits are calculated and added to that amount. On this slide, you only have one number to insert for total fringe benefits on salaries included in sections A and B. The way that you calculate the fringe benefit amount you include should be explained on the budget justification, stating the fringe benefit rate that was used. So, as you prepare your budget, you will need to obtain the correct fringe benefit to use, rate to use from your institution's Human Resources Department. Fringe benefit expense should be prorated based on the percent of the person's time being supported by the grant. So if they're being supported for, say it's a 12-month employee that's being supported for 25% of their salary, then you would put 25% of the fringe benefits as well. If the grant is supporting 10% of a person's salary, then it should be supporting 10% of total fringe benefits for the individual. This slide points out that all personnel except graduate students should be included in your fringe benefit calculation. Now, I'll ask the MATEC team to facilitate so that Celeste can answer questions you may have at this point.
Thank you, Elaine. There are several questions that came in. Celeste, you might have addressed this, or it may be coming up, but when you have release time, you put the wage request for faculty for the faculty that's on release or for the person that's filling in for them? In just a moment, Celeste, I forgot to unmute your phone. Just a second. Okay, there you go.
Okay, I think you can do it either way. If you do it for your, let's say it's yourself that you are requesting a course release time, and then you are expecting that your institution will be putting an adjunct in place for the course that you're having a release from, then your institution is going to have a little more money probably coming their way because your salary and benefits are going to be more than what they would pay the adjunct. But you can actually do it either way.
Okay, you'll take either one. It's up to the institution then.
That's correct.
Now, thinking along the same question, along the same lines, I've got an adjunct, the faculty member that I want to add. Is it just a matter of just simply putting his or her salary in, or do I do anything special about using adjuncts?
I think the big thing with using adjuncts is, and this is a little bit outside the scope of why you're crafting your budget the way you are, but one of the things you want to think about for the reviewers and the NSF staff that will read your proposal is they want to know that the project that you are proposing and the people involved, that there's a way to sustain what you're going to do. So if you are developing a new course, you're asking for release time to develop that course, but you also need, you're going to bring in an adjunct because you may not have all of the specific requirements to develop the course. Maybe that's not part of your expertise. So you're bringing on an adjunct that has that expertise. And as you read through the proposal, reviewers and NSF staff might say, well, so is the adjunct going to be kept on? Is this going to be the person who would be teaching that course in the future when it's developed? Because, hey, that's the person who had the expertise. You would want to have some sort of an explanation about why that adjunct is there now, what their expertise is. And in some cases, I suggest to people that if everything goes forward, the proposal receives really good reviews by reviewers and it's negotiated towards an award, you might want to think about asking your institution to include a letter that says, we will commit to either keeping this person with that expertise who would be going forward teaching this course or program or whatever it is, or we would expect to be hiring another individual with a similar set of skills. So I think that can be a very good thing to convince reviewers that you're really thinking about the sustainability of this project. This isn't something that's going to go away in 3 years.
I think you're right. We don't want to have any unanswered questions in the mind of the reviewers here. We want to know something. That's a good point. One more question, and then we'll move forward in the interest of time. What if you don't know somebody's salary? One of the questions that came into our chat window is, what if you don't know someone's salary? Can you make a guess at it? That might not be the best thing.
I would say that's not a good thing to do, and this would be a great opportunity for you to go down and become acquainted with the finance people at your administration. You're going to want them to know what you're doing anyway, And they're a great resource for you, and they will help you on the whole, all aspects of developing this budget, because it isn't you that commits the funds when you submit a proposal. As a matter of fact, you can put all of this material in FastLane, and if you don't have a registered representative, an authorized representative from your institution hit the final button, I never get to see your proposal. It's your institution that commits to every line of this budget. So you go down and meet those people in finance and get them to help you.
Good point. You mentioned FastLane and grants.gov. Is FastLane going away? Is it going to be some point where I'm not going to be able to log in FastLane anymore and I'm going to be forced to grants.gov? Is there a time frame?
I think, I don't know the time frame, but I think what would replace it is research.gov. I guess on my part, and this is just a comment on my part, has nothing to do with an official stance. I've used both. I've found FastLane to be much easier to use than grants.gov. Some people might argue with me, but one of the reasons we stress using FastLane at this point, as long as it's available, is that there are several forms that the National Science Foundation requires that you fill out so that your proposal will be accepted and go forward to review, and they are not supported on grants.gov. So what typically happens is, it's, first of all, it's harder for our system to capture all the information on grants.gov, and then the system will sit there and say, this is an incomplete proposal. So you will get extra emails or extra notifications that if you don't fill out this form or that form, that this isn't going to go forward.
That's a good point. So we'll keep our eye on that, but right now it's FastLane's good.
Yes.
There's a couple more questions left, but for interest of time, we're going to move forward. Take a look at the chat window there. These are tough questions, right, about mixing overload and things like that. So if we have time, we'll come back to them at the end. Folks, let's move forward and talk about equipment. That's an important thing to many of us. So go ahead, presenters, continue with the equipment slide.
Thank you, Mike. This is Ellen. I'm happy to be with you all today. I'm going to pick up and talk about equipment. So NSF allows you to budget for equipment and instrumentation costs in your grant budget. So this is items such as computers, computer-related hardware, laboratory or field instrumentation, or scientific or industrial machinery, provided that these items are necessary to support your grant activities and that they are not otherwise available or accessible. And do keep in mind that you'll need to justify any equipment you're purchasing for the grant in terms of student use and learning outcomes. And any equipment purchased must have a service life of over 1 year. So in terms of budgeting for equipment, if you look at the form and the top line here, list items and dollar amounts for each item exceeding $5,000. So this is where you would list single items with an acquisition cost of $5,000 or more. So in addition to the price of the equipment, you'd need to factor in the cost of any modifications or accessories that are needed to make the equipment usable for its intended purposes to come up with this total acquisition cost. So as an example, if you're purchasing a piece of machinery that costs $4,000, but it requires 2 attachments that cost $500 each to make it usable, that brings your total equipment acquisition cost to $5,000, and it would be budgeted here in this category. As another example, if you were purchasing laboratory equipment or some type of instrumentation that individually costs less than $5,000, then that would be budgeted under materials and supplies, which we'll cover shortly. I also just want to make a quick reference. You do know that there are some budget restrictions in the sense that if you're budgeting for equipment and applying under a full project grant, your equipment budget cannot exceed $200,000 for the full duration of the grant. But as the majority of you on today's call are applying to NSF under the small grants for those new to ATE category, your total grant budget can exceed $200,000. So you need to think about your equipment costs as relative and reasonable to the overall scope of your individual budget. And just as a tip, including a budget that requests funds for equipment that take up all or most of your budget would not be a good idea. So in addition to budgeting reasonably for equipment costs and justifying as to why they're needed for your project, equipment must be acquired in accordance with your college's organizational practice. And as Elaine mentioned earlier, your college may budget things differently than NSF budget things, and that certainly could apply to equipment in that your college classifies equipment differently than NSF. But you will need to go by NSF's definition of equipment when budgeting, preparing your budget. And just a few quick takes on what equipment is not. NSF funds can't be used to support costs that would normally be made if you didn't have a grant, such as laboratory upgrades or routine teaching activities, nor can it be used for general utility items, such as office equipment or office furniture. And most importantly, and it bears repeating, all equipment costs will need to be detailed in your budget justification, and that includes addressing why you need it, who will be using it, and how it will be used. Then we move into travel. So the travel line is only to be used to budget for travel costs for project staff or college personnel that may not be project staff but are traveling to help accomplish project objectives, so such as faculty members that need to attend a professional development meeting to be able to test project-generated materials in their classes, for example. So you would not budget for travel of advisory committee members, speakers, or consultants under this category, only project staff and college personnel traveling for the project. You may include only travel necessary to accomplish project objectives. For example, funds can be requested for field work, attendance at meetings and conferences, and other travel associated with the proposed work. And attendance at meetings or conferences must be necessary to accomplish your proposal objectives or disseminate your project results. So in budgeting, most institutions have their own guidelines on things such as mileage rates or per diem, and NSF accepts these, as the budgeted travel allowance should be consistent with the policies of your organization as administrators of the grant. However, do note some restrictions on travel. You must book the most economical form of travel, such as economy class airfare, so unfortunately no first class seats allowed. Travel expenses must be reasonable in terms of the number of trips that you take and the amount budgeted for each trip. So you'll need to detail your travel expenses, including accurate estimates in the budget justification. So if you're budgeting to attend a conference, you need to include the actual hotel rates for how many dates of attendance. You'll need to search airfares for your time frame of travel and include them, and as well as include costs for meals and ground transportation costs. A very important consideration is that it is unallowable to use federal funds for alcohol or for entertainment costs. And as an example of something that would go in the travel line, this is where you would budget as a new PI to attend the National ATE Principal Investigators Conference held in October in Washington, D.C. It's a good idea to include funds, and it's also listed in the program solicitation that you would include funds for at least 2 team members and up to 5 to attend the annual ATE PI conference. So if you're applying for an ATE grant in October 2016 and it's funded, you would be expected to attend the 2017 ATE conference. Note that ACC does provide some assistance for the ATE conference. We cover the cost of registration and 2 nights lodging for 2 people per project to attend. So you'd want to consider budgeting airfare and other travel costs to from Washington, D.C. For those 2 team members, and for full travel lodging and a registration fee of $300 for any additional team members that you were considering bringing to the conference. And AACC or Mentor Connect can also assist with providing more details on budgeting accurately for attending ATE. Moving forward to participant support. If your college is planning to host or offer conferences or meetings, training workshops, or other short-term instructional or informational sharing activities as part of your grant, the cost to support those participants or the trainees of those events would be budgeted here under participant support. So participant support costs can be used for stipends, travel, and other related costs to support attendance at workshops or conferences. It's important to distinguish between participants and project staff. Participants are not employees. These are the individuals who are recipients of a service or training provided by your college's NSF's event or training activity. While participants perform no direct work for the project, they are a vital part of your grant activities, and you can and should require them to complete training activities and provide input to be eligible to receive stipends and or travel support. forward here. So here on this slide, this is where participant support cost is budgeted in 4 categories. Listed here: stipends, travel, subsistence, and other. So when budgeting, please consider that all participant support costs must be reasonable and be limited to the days of attendance at the event, plus the actual travel time required to reach the event location by the most direct route available. Participant support costs should also conform with the policy of the college or the grantee organization by following your college's travel policies. And you'll need to provide detailed information in the budget justification pertaining to your participant support costs. So under stipends, you'd need to provide the stipend amount that each participant would receive and what expenses are figured into the provision of the stipend. Under travel, you'd need to explain the purpose of the travel and the time allotted. And again, please note that this travel line is separate from Section E travel that I mentioned previously. Travel in Section E is for project personnel, and this travel in Section F under participant support is, again, for your participants or your trainees. And other subsistence, you'd need to provide the amount allotted for subsistence, which can be a food per diem, and again, specify the period for which that covers. So you'll also need to consider that if meals or lodging are furnished without charge or at a nominal cost to the participant, such as having some of those costs be included in a registration fee, then the per diem or the subsistence allowance would need to be correspondingly reduced. So as an example, if breakfast and lunch are included as part of your training activity, you can't also reimburse the participant for those costs, for the cost of those meals. And as I mentioned previously, can't be stressed enough, don't use the NSF funds to go to the bar or for entertainment. And under other, this is where you would list any other expenses associated for participants and how it's relevant or necessary for the project. Now there's some special budget considerations around participant support. If you go back here, you'll see at the bottom number of participants. You definitely want to fill this in. You need to specify the number of participants to be engaged in and served by the project. Also note that this is kind of considered a sacred category in the sense that any money you put into participant support, you cannot pull out without getting NSF approval. And new this year, just as of January, in addition to not being able to transfer money out of this budget category, you also can't move money around within the specific categories. So going back, you can't move what you have in stipends to travel or travel to other, for example, again, without program officer approval. So you would need to go into FastLane and explain why you wanted to move funds between categories or move funds out of participant support, and they would need to formally approve that before you'd be authorized to do so. And now I'd actually like to turn it back to Celeste to give you some program officer tips, particularly around the category of participant support.
Great, thank you, Ellen. And I know there's been a few other questions coming in that hopefully we'll be able to address towards the end. But let me just stick with participant support. Although I know at least one question is if we are impacting our existing faculty in new coursework. So these would be people that are not part of your project staff. They're not the PI, co-PI, or your senior personnel. So there's other faculty that you want to impact. That's actually okay to have them in participant support because this could be one of your main sources of dissemination. And one example might be that you want to hold a workshop every summer and you expect to have between 25 and 35 participants every year. If part of this workshop is to impact the faculty at your own institution who maybe have known you had something going on, although I don't know, I don't think most of the people at my institution ever knew what I was doing. That's probably my fault there. But if you want other people to be teaching, whether it's a new teaching strategy, maybe you're trying to get flipped classrooms in biology or chemistry, something like that, you can have your own other faculty who are not project staff on there. This must add value to the project. It can't just be, hey, it would be great to have a workshop every summer and we can all get around and sit around and talk about what we're doing and not do anything afterwards. So this is one of those ideas that you want to think about. If you're going to have a workshop, and let's say it is for faculty, you expect faculty to hopefully learn something while they're at your workshop, hopefully you also expect them to go back to their own institution and implement something that they learned. So one of the things that reviewers are starting to look for is, have you thought about that in advance? Because the ultimate thing, really our ultimate goal would be the faculty takes it back and they implement it at their institution, but who are we really worried about? We're worried about, do the students learn something? So one of the things you might think about if you're proposing workshops is working with your evaluator to come up with even a fairly brief survey that when a person comes to your workshop, they agree to implement something in their own courses at their home institution, and they will use that survey to actually find out what the impact was on student learning. So that's just kind of I think an added point that reviewers really look at that and go, boy, these people planned really well. They're really thinking about what happened with the faculty, but they're pushing it and they're thinking about what happens when the faculty go back and impact their students. You can include stipends for high school teachers and students. Again, stipends for college faculty, but travel might end up being more important. As has been stated before, no alcohol, but food is certainly an essential part. And remember, put the number of participants down. It really does look odd when you request a total of, let's say even on a small new to ATE award, you want $65,000 and there's no participants listed. So people are going to wonder about that. And remember that you all have the authority to move funds around within this budget. Again, I would say go talk to your financial people and work with them, except for this one participant support category. You do need to go into FastLane and fill out a request to move funds out or within those lines. And again, you can't do the final submission there. It's your institution's authorized representative who has to hit the final button, and then a program officer will review it and say, well, you guys have provided a good rationale. You thought you were going to have 35 people each year at your workshop, and you actually only ended up with 25, so you're coming to the end of your project. You've got some really important uses for that money, and we agree with you. We think this is a good idea, so we would recommend it for approval, and it would then move forward, and you could actually move those funds out of participant support. So I think those are some of the most important points to make.
Thank you, Celeste.
And
I'm going to run through the rest of direct costs. I know that there's a number of questions piling up in the chat room, so we're going to try to go through this quickly so we can address those. So other direct costs that would be included in your proposal budget are materials and supplies, publication costs, consultant services, computer services, subcontracts, and other. So materials and supplies, these are items that are project-specific, demonstrated as necessary to run the project, and cost $5,000 or less. So if you remember, equipment is classified as having total acquisition cost of $5,000 or more, and so this category would exclude equipment. As an example, if you're purchasing 20 handheld GPS units for surveying at a cost of $300 per unit for a total cost of $6,000, this amount would be budgeted under materials and supplies, as the individual cost per unit is under $5,000. Again, note NSF doesn't allow for the purchases of desk or office furniture or for general office supplies that are not being used exclusively for the project. So materials and supplies need to be directly tied to the project, and items such as plasticware, for example, chemicals, and project-specific office supplies can be budgeted here. Under publication, documentation, and dissemination, funds may be requested relating to documenting, preparing, publishing, or sharing research or supporting materials coming out of your grant activities. And this generally includes reports, editing, documentation, storage and indexing of data in databases, web pages, page charges for publications in journals if you're publishing, and productions of posters. So for example, as a new ATE PI, one of the expectations in attending the ATE conference is that you would participate in a showcase session. So funds in this category could be used to develop an exhibit or a poster or other materials to disseminate information on your project outcomes. So just as an example of something you could include there. Consultant services. This is where you would budget for people that are working on the project but are not a part of the project staff. So this applies to those individuals that are paid a fee for service as external contractors. Note you'll need to justify and identify your need for consultants in the budget justification, as well as include anticipated costs and length of service that details how many days or hours the consultant will work and at what rate of pay. So NSF requires that information be given on time and effort, so you need to be specific and not just include a lump sum in your budget without explanation. So for example, when budgeting for the use of a consultant and you've got $6,000 you've put in, you'll have to go through and give the level of detail, where $6,000 might be 10 days at $500 a day plus $1,000 for travel expenses, or 60 hours at $80 per hour plus $1,200 for travel expenses. So you're going to need that level of detail. And you can't budget to pay a consultant more than the reasonable and regular rate of pay. As an example, an external evaluator is often budgeted as a consultant to a project, and you'll want to have a named evaluator in your proposal. On average, 7% of an AD project budget is spent on evaluation, and small grants may spend less. And some things you'll want to think about when budgeting for evaluation is the time of the evaluator, travel costs, materials, and any other expenses in your own institutional indirect or overhead costs entailed. Project evaluation merits a webinar unto itself, and that's actually coming up. We'll be specifically diving into that topic on an upcoming webinar, Small Project Evaluation Principles and Practice, on March 23rd. So we won't go into depth on budgeting specifically for evaluation here, but we'll refer you to the more comprehensive webinar coming up next month. Computer services. The cost of computer services may be requested only if your existing institutional policy is to bill computer services as direct costs. This category typically refers to costs for computer-based retrieval of scientific or technical data and information necessary to support or inform your work. And when budgeting, you'd have to include a justification of established computer service rates at your institution. So again, this is not a place where general purposes computer equipment such as word processing would be requested. Subawards. New grantees are not likely to have subawards. That is, some of you on the webinar may be applying for larger projects that could include a subaward. We'll spend a minute going over this budget category. So subawards are used to fund a discrete portion of work that's carried out by another organization. And the subcontracting PI is responsible for the work proposed in the subaward, and the subawardee is responsible for management and oversight of the subaward budget. However, the prime institution, which is your college, is ultimately responsible for all project work, including that of the subaward. Note, subawards require separate budgets. So on the main budget form, you would list the total annual subaward cost, but your budget justification must include details on the subaward, including a description of the work to be performed and a clear description of the basis of selection for the subawardee. So again, subawardees are named on the budget. They have a separate budget for each subawardee that has to be included. And in addition, in order to even list a subawardee, that organization needs to be registered in FastLane. So you want to make sure that is completed as well. And other direct costs, any other direct costs not previously identified and that are necessary to perform the project must be included here, detailed and itemized in the budget justification. And I want to go to a poll here to help illustrate a little bit of this and to see if you're, what you're thinking about how to budget for an evaluator. So I'm going to ask Mike to launch this poll, and I'm going to ask Celeste to address it. So J.K. Smith at XYZ University will be your evaluator. How should this person be compensated?
Ellen, we have a lot of people answering. They can adjust the size of their poll if they need to see all the questions, but it looks like the preponderance is consultant, but some folks think it could be either a consultant or a subaward. How would you answer this one, Ellen?
Well, I think Ellen turned it over to me.
She did, excuse me, yes.
That's all right, and it could be either as a consultant or in a subaward, and part of that would depend on the person you're working with. Interestingly enough, part of the question was, this person is at XYZ University. So that person may actually end up with their own institutional requirements as to how they are contracting out their time with another institution, your institution. So you could, depending on what the person wants to do, you could really do it either way. So it's might be a little easier as a consultant because you have one daily rate and the number of days the person would work versus a subaward where you have to have the other institution registered and all of the rest of it. But you can do it either way.
You know, Celeste, a question came up. I'm just going to jump on it right now. Does the NSF have something called an approved consulting rate, or is it what's considered a reasonable consulting rate?
I think it's basically a reasonable rate. You know, I think this is one of the things where when you come and review at the National Science Foundation, reviewers are told that they are responsible for reading your 15-page project description. Actually, since we're talking about evaluators, this is a great place to say this. I've noticed more and more people are including their evaluation plan not in their 15 pages, but in supplementary documents. We tell people, hey, a weak evaluation plan isn't really a fatal flaw, but if you start putting things that should be in your 15 pages into your supplementary documents, you're going to end up with lower review ratings because of that. What would be acceptable is, let's say you give your full plan with working with your evaluator in your 15 pages, and then you've mentioned that you have a novel survey instrument that has already been developed, but you think would be perfect with a little tweaking for this particular project you are proposing. You could put that 1 or 2 page survey, I hope not too much more than that, into supplementary documents and direct people there. But your plan itself needs to be in those 15 pages. And I would say really work with people a reasonable rate. If someone says, well, I'm going to charge you $6,000 a day for my 8 hours of work, you'd be fairly skeptical, as well as the reviewers and all the rest of us here at the National Science Foundation.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, thanks for those comments. Are we turning back to Ellen? I think you're going to talk about summary directs and then indirects.
Yes, I'm just wrapping up total direct costs. So this is the sample form from FastLane that would calculate your total direct cost. So this is the easy part. If you've entered all your numbers correctly, the total direct cost of your grant proposal will be calculated for you. But you still need to work on your indirect costs, and I'm actually going to pass it over to Elaine to cover indirect costs with you.
Thanks, Ellen. Every institution receiving a grant award from the NSF must include indirect costs in the budget. This is money from the grant that helps support the business office and other functions of the college. Including indirect costs is mandatory. Your college must include in the budget and recover indirect costs at the federally approved rate that applies at the time the grant award is made. That rate will apply throughout the life of the grant, even if the college's rate changes in the interim. You will need to determine if your institution already has a rate established. These rates change over time, so make certain that the one used in your proposal is current. During the funding process, you will be asked to provide verification of your rate. If your institution does not have a rate established, your institution will not be able to apply for one until your grant proposal has been recommended for funding. At that time, your college will likely be referred to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services to negotiate the rate. So, what do you do in the meantime? If your institution does not have an indirect cost rate established, a federally negotiated indirect cost rate, NSF has recently clarified that institutions should apply the NSF de minimis rate until a rate for your college has been determined. The de minimis rate is defined by NSF as 10% of modified total direct costs. This means the amount remaining once ineligible expenses are subtracted from the total direct costs for the project. For example, participant support costs and equipment costs are not eligible for indirect and must be subtracted. The subaward budget category is another for which full indirect costs are not allowed. NSF does allow the first $25,000 of a subaward to be included in indirect cost calculations. It is important to pay close attention to the impact that indirect costs have on your project budget. Indirect costs are included in the total grant amount. not added to, but included within. This amount is not in addition to the amount that you're requesting for the project. So don't get tangled up about this. I'll just give you a couple of real-life examples. One new to ATE college thought they were submitting a small grant for institutions new to ATE in October 2014. However, after budgeting their project for the allowable maximum $200,000 grant amount, they added their indirect costs on top of that amount. This kicked the proposal out of the small grants category during the pre-review NSF sorting process. The proposal was then reviewed within the much more competitive category of regular project grants, and sadly, the proposal was declined. In another situation, a community college discovered that they would be required to use their statewide community college system indirect cost rate of 54%, which had the effect of cutting the amount of grant funds available to run the project in half. This had a huge impact on their project plan. Reworking a budget to accommodate indirect costs is not uncommon. The sooner you understand what the impact of indirect costs are on your overall budget, the better you can plan your scope of work. There are a couple of things you can keep in mind as you grapple with the issue of indirect costs that must be applied to your grant budget. First, institutions may have more than one federally negotiated indirect cost rate. For example, it's not uncommon to have an on-campus rate and an off-campus rate. The off-campus rate is typically considerably lower. What is important to understand about this is that NSF lets the college choose which of their federally negotiated indirect cost rates to use on a proposal. At my college, for example, the on-campus rate is over 40%, whereas the off-campus rate is 15%. So for this Mentor Connect project that's bringing you the webinar today, the college authorized my use of the 15% off-campus rate, which allowed more grant funds to be applied to grant activities and personnel support. Another thing to keep in mind, actually considered by some as a secret, is that the NSF never asks how the college uses the indirect costs it collects on a grant. That money is the college's to use for operations as it sees fit. In some situations, we have known the college president to allocate indirect costs collected from a grant back to the project or department that is implementing the project. So you may want to explore this possibility at your location too. The bottom line is you've got to use a federally negotiated rate or the de minimis rate. You can't opt to use a lesser amount or to not charge indirect at all. That's classified by NSF as voluntary cost sharing, and voluntary cost sharing is prohibited. So just keep all this in mind because the indirect costs really can impact, the scope of work of your project. So now let's look at how you calculate indirect costs for your budget. For determining the indirect cost amount for your project, you will need to determine something called the base amount for the indirect cost calculation. Indirect costs are typically either based on an institution's personnel costs, it may be salary or salary and fringe benefits, or on the cost of all institutional operations. If based on personnel, which is the most common, then the base will be the total for personnel salaries and perhaps fringe benefits you are requesting in your budget. If the indirect cost is based on all institutional operations costs, then the calculation is a little more complicated. As mentioned previously, NSF does not allow indirect costs to be calculated on participant support, on equipment, or for the most part, on subawards. In the case of an indirect cost rate on all college operating costs, to determine the base for the indirect cost calculation, you must subtract the budgeted amounts in the disallowed categories or line items from your direct cost total to determine the base. You should explain your base amount on the budget form where it asks for the indirect cost item. Once the base amount has been determined on the budget form, you enter the base amount for the calculation and the indirect cost rate. The budget form will then automatically calculate indirect costs. As a reminder, These indirect costs are contained within the overall grant proposal budget request. The total amount of your budget request must not exceed the limit for the category of project funding you are requesting. For a small grant for institutions new to ATE, the budget total must not exceed $200,000 for the life of the project. It can be tricky to get all of this worked out right, which is just one more good reason not to put budget work off until the last minute. So let's recap. You must include indirect cost in your proposal budget. Either your institution already has an indirect cost rate or the NSF de minimis rate must be used until a federally negotiated indirect rate is established for your institution. The categories of costs to be used for determining the base for your indirect rate calculation are determined when the rate is negotiated. The costs for which the rate applies are noted in your negotiated indirect cost rate document. If you use the NSF de minimis rate, the base will be determined by a calculation of total modified direct costs. Some NSF budget categories or line items are not eligible for indirect costs. Now we're getting to the bottom line. When you select the Calculate button, the system will automatically determine the total direct and indirect costs being requested. You'll see on this slide where you've got the indirect cost item, that's where you describe how the basis for your indirect cost has been determined or what costs are being excluded from that. So this is where the total direct and indirect costs are calculated, and this is actually going to be the amount of your grant proposal request. Notice category K. Budget category K, residual funds, is not applicable to NSF ATE grants, so you can just skip that section. And then the next line is the amount of your request, which will be a total of your direct and indirect costs. After completing all of this work, like magic, you have a neatly formatted budget in the system. Each year's budget will look like this, and then the cumulative budget will show all years and an overall total for your budget request. As you can see, the budget form does not provide a way for you to provide details about why you're requesting funds. So the next thing we will do after this question break is talk about your budget justification. Mike?
Thank you very much, Elaine. I have a question that came up, and it's an interesting one. I'll paraphrase it slightly. What happens if, and maybe Celeste will chime in too, what happens if the indirect cost rate changes? Like suppose your institution renegotiates it during your project. Do you get more money from the NSF to accommodate that, or how does it work? Celeste, do you want to take that first? Yeah.
Sure, I can take that. It depends on when you renegotiate the rate. So what I've seen happen in a couple of instances in the last year or so is that as a program officer, I've made a recommendation to make an award, and everything has gone down to the Division of Grants and Agreements, which is where the grant officer will actually go over your budget very, very carefully, read everything that I've written and that anyone else has commented on, and then they're the actual ones that make the award. I have seen that they check on a daily basis, and when they find out when it hasn't been awarded yet, but they're looking at the federally negotiated rates for your institution, if they see that you've come in and it's different from what you have in your budget, they will ask you to submit a revised budget at that time. It cannot exceed the total request that you had, because upstairs here in the Division of Undergraduate Education, I'm already working on my master budget spreadsheet based on what the amount was initially. So you will have to figure out how to carve out things out of your other budget categories so that you can meet your institution's new rate. If it happens after the award letter has gone out, You're not going to be able to ask us for more money. You are not going to have to change the indirect rate. You use the indirect rate that was in the award letter as stated in the budget at that time. So hopefully that helps.
Okay, it does make sense. We don't have a ton of time, but let me jump back to a question that I think I've seen come up more and more. You know, we've been encouraging our projects to work more closely with industry to create more and more work experiences for students like internships. Can those be supported, maybe under participant supports, or how would that play? Money for internships?
Yeah, that we can't do scholarships, and internships is a little bit iffy. Although I know how important they can be. I know that with my industry partners and all of the people that my students would go to, my industry would say, we understand that this is a required course, and we understand that you say you'll cover them for insurance and all the rest of it and everything else, but we don't want them in our facility or on our floor unless they are covered by us, so we will pay them.
Right.
I think you've got to make a good case that your students aren't going to be able to take advantage of the internship opportunities unless you can give them some form of a stipend. Can't be listed as a scholarship, but paying an internship at times is acceptable. It can really eat up a lot of money. So you want to be careful how you craft that and what you think about if and when you want to put that into a budget. And you can always call up or email one of us, the program officers at the National Science Foundation, and run it by us.
That's a very interesting discussion, and I bet you we're going to see more of that as we try to get more of these student opportunities. Thanks, Celeste. You know what, folks, we're going to go forward into the final section of our thing, which has to do with budget justification. This is a critical topic. I'm guessing we might run a minute or two over today, and certainly you're welcome to leave at the end, but we're going to keep going for a few extra minutes today to cover this topic. So let's go ahead now.
Thanks, Mike. As you can see, the budget form does not provide a way for you to provide the details about why you are requesting the fund. So you prepare a budget justification for this purpose. This is your chance to demonstrate that your budget is right for your project. It is important that reviewers conclude that you are not asking for too little or too much money to accomplish the work of the plan you have described in your proposal. The reason you are requesting funds for various purposes should be logical. You should never ask for money in the budget that doesn't tie directly to an activity, something, or someone you have described in the project description. One of the biggest flaws that we see is somebody putting a piece of equipment in the budget and then nowhere in the project description does it describe what they're going to do with that piece of equipment or why it was necessary for the project. The budget and the project description should be mutually supportive. You are allowed up to 3 pages for your budget justification. It is uploaded separately within the budget section and is not counted towards any other page limits in preparing the proposal. There is no specific or specified format required for a budget justification. I will share an example of a commonly used format. Let's see here, Mike. The slide I was looking for wasn't where I thought it was.
I'm sorry about that, Lane. Are you okay now?
Okay. Yeah. You will want to think about your budget justification as if this were your money. If someone asked you for money, what would you want to know? How much money? If the total is made up of several costs, such as travel, how much is being requested for each component part of the total? From whom do you need the money? Personnel, participants, consultants? Who are these people? What do they contribute to the project? With what compensation? Over what period of time? What items do you plan to purchase and why? How will the items and equipment be used in a project activity to benefit students or participants? Attention to detail is important to reviewers. They want to know that you have really thought through and calculated what resources will be needed for the project to be successful. And be careful. Don't be vague. Someone once told me that they've not seen a funding source yet that would fund, etc. So be careful about saying vague terms like and other or etc. or something like that. You need to be very, very specific. Now, here's an example of a narrative budget justification. Notice the way that it is formatted in that those alphabet letters that I talked to you about earlier are showing up again. This is a very helpful thing for reviewers and for program officers so that your budget justification aligns specifically to the budget. So you see there's senior personnel, other personnel. You can look at all the details, and when you get your copies of these PowerPoint slides, you can see the kind of information that's provided by person, by year, totals, how fringe benefits are calculated, at what rate, that sort of thing. Under travel, you'll notice that you do your research. You put in, the typical hotel costs, how many days, what are the flights, what are all the travel costs that are going to be included. It's become shocking, for instance, that you can buy an airline ticket for $500 and then you get hit for another $25 each way to check your bags. So just think through all of those costs and make sure that your budget explains why you're asking for that amount of money. Under the participant support category, Ellen has covered that, and you'll see the kind of detail that's helpful to reviewers in that section of the budget. Under your materials and supplies, you want to be very specific about that. And you'll notice here in this category, this is that other direct cost category. In this case, there were no computer services and no subawards, but notice in this budget justification, they've put those numbers and categories in there and just put none beside it. This is helpful too. It keeps it straight, and it allows your reviewers to know that you didn't just overlook that category, that you just were not requesting costs in that category. So be careful with your budget justification. You don't want it to be too long, beyond the 3 pages, but don't be too short either. Give them a lot of detail. Don't put in a justification that is hard to follow. If somebody has to really work at it, they'll think that you're trying to hide things. So use the alphabet letters, lay it out very clearly, be very specific. Be sure you put your time and rate for consultants. If you just put $3,000 for a consultant and do not explain what that cost includes and what you're going to get for that, that won't fly. Your time for personnel is not justified. Be sure you say what somebody's going to be doing for that amount of money. Don't include overload pay for full-time faculty. Materials and supplies category should not be used as a slush fund. So, reviewers are going to be on them, and program officers are going to be on the lookout for that. And don't include part-time faculty as consultants or participants. Okay, Mike, back to you for a final question or two.
Elaine, we have just another minute. A couple of detailed questions. I'll ask you first, and you should feel free to turn to Celeste. I'm writing my budget justification for equipment. Can I include things like warranties or training that sometimes come with the equipment? Or for that matter, sales tax? Does all of that get bundled into the dollar I put for equipment there?
The sales tax, yes. What was the other item?
Warranty and training.
And the answer to that is no.
Yeah.
No on the warranty.
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah. That's like basically your institution. The equipment will belong to your institution at the end of this award.
Yes.
And so it's your institution that is responsible for things like maintenance contracts and that sort of thing. So you don't get to include that. And that's actually very clearly specified in the grant proposal guide.
Okay, good.
So in addition to the solicitation, read the grant proposal guide.
I know this is a detailed cost, but it comes up a lot. So I'm printing. Is that a direct cost, or should it be considered my institution paying for it as part of their indirects? How do I think about printing? Celeste, let's go to you with that.
Okay. Okay. So I would want to know what are you saying you're going to print? Are you preparing for a workshop and you are printing materials that are specific for that workshop? Then I would say you actually could have put print costs in other under participant support, because that's something you're doing that is supporting effectively carrying out that workshop. If it's I'm trying to think of other reasons you'd be printing. I'm kind of drawing a blank on that. I mean, most of what I think I used to do would be workshop things.
Right.
And other than that, sort of general run-of-the-mill stuff. Most of the time, I ended up using whatever my account was on the copier or print or at the print shop.
Sure, makes sense. Right. Okay.
However, I would, Mike, I would add, remember, participant support is the only category that you are required to ask permission to move funds either out of or amongst those categories. Every other line, you have full authority to move it around as you see fit. So let's say you were buying computers, and you had it under materials and supplies because they're less than $5,000 each.
Yes.
And you asked for an educational discount, got a great discount when you finally went out to buy them. You have some extra money there. You could actually move that down and or use it for print, some of your printing costs if you needed to. And you don't have to tell me about it or any other NSF program officer at all. You just want it clearly detailed in your financial spreadsheet, so that should anybody ever come looking at it, they would see, oh, so you got a great deal on these computers and you use the residual funds to print whatever.
Well, good. That makes a lot of sense. That flexibility is so important to a project as it's struggling to meet its goals or trying to exceed its goals. So that's appreciated very much. Another quick question on subawards. That could be a whole topic itself too, I know. The first $25K on a subaward is not susceptible to indirects. Is that per year or total across the grant? The $25K, Celeste.
What I would do in that case, because I'm not 100% sure, I would actually go ask the grants officer. And I'm sorry we don't have Rashawn on the webinar with us. I would actually turn that. I can ask him, and maybe what we could do is when we're posting responses to questions, I can get his response and we can put it on the site.
Okay, that makes sense. Well, at this point, folks, I appreciate Mentor Connect's offer that you might have seen in the chat window. They're going to try to address the questions, just like that one, Celeste, that we had come up today, and then cycle that back through to the attendees, because we do have a lot of questions, and some of them are read the grant proposal guide like mine, but others are important ones, so thank you. Celeste, thank you very much for being part of this today. I'm going to turn our final little segment over to Charlotte. Charlotte, you're going to take us through to the end, right?
That's correct. And at this time, I'd just like to thank everybody. It's amazing. We've had a wonderful turnout here today, and glad that you've stuck with us through the duration of the webinar. Just a couple of more points of emphasis. First of all, I'd like to take a moment to thank Dr. Carter again for her amazing answers to your questions and assistance, and always supporting this Mentor Connect effort. We truly value your time and presence. Also, for the attendees, please connect with Mentor Connect. We have a number of ways that you can keep in contact with us, as you can see here. Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, which is where these archive webinars will be located at the end. So if you have colleagues who may have missed this production, the full presentations will be available. But as has been stated through the chat box, if you have registered for this webinar, you will get links to access the presentation. We would also like to make sure that you are aware that this webinar and others produced by Mentor Connect will be available in a tutorial format. This allows you to get even more of a nuts and bolts approach to the material without having to sit through the entire recording. So to take advantage of that valuable tool, please visit www.mentorconnect.org and click on Visit Our Library, and you'll be able to have full access to that type of tutorial. The live events are always essential because, as you can see, there are a lot of questions, and we facilitate those live, so please keep attending the live webinars. However, it's also valuable that we have tools available for you to use online. So, on behalf of our project team, we'd like to thank you again for your participation. We love serving you, and if you would, take a moment to complete our survey, and we hope to see you on a webinar such as this next time, which will be next month, March 23rd, covering evaluation for small projects. So thank you again, and Mike will facilitate the survey at this time.
Thanks very much, Charlotte. If for those of you online, your survey will either pop up or you'll have a little link that says browse to. If you would just take a moment and complete that, there's just a couple of questions on the survey. So as we're wrapping up today, Dr. Carter, thank you again. Ellen from AACC, Elaine for all that interesting information, and finally Charlotte, thank you for that. I'll leave the survey open for a couple of minutes. Remember, the NSF program officers actually welcome your questions. I didn't mean to sound like that, but they do respond. They don't always respond immediately, but they do respond to your questions, so please take advantage to do that. So that officially concludes our webinar today. I will leave the survey open. Presenters, you can just go ahead and disconnect your audio system, and thank you again, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.